So I'm gonna start a new sketch and call this color modes example. And if we look at the P5 reference for a moment, if we go to color, you can see that there's a lot of functions related to color. The one we're going to look at for a moment is color mode. So color mode changes the way that P5 creates colors with the arguments that we use. And so we can change from RGB. In the previous lesson earlier today, I kind of talked about how we don't really think of color in terms of RGB. That's how the computer thinks of color, but it's not easy for us to mix colors using RGB. What is more typical to the way that people think about colors is HSB, sometimes called HSV or HSL, but it's just a combination of hue, which is like the color, basically red or green or blue, the saturation, the amount of color, and then the brightness. And if we look back at our color picker on Adobe, we can see these different versions. So in RGB, we looked at that earlier. We kind of have to mix these color channels together, and it's not super intuitive. If we change to the color mode to HSB, this is a little more intuitive. Our first slider is the hue. So we are just moving between different colors. And then our second slider is the saturation. So that's the amount of color. So if we have the saturation full, we get the full amount of color. If we have it completely down to 0, then depending on the lightness, we get something that has no color value in it. The brightness or lightness is how bright the color is. So if it's completely dark, we'll get black, whereas if it's completely light, we'll get whatever the color is. So we have the same, at the end of the day, we end up with the same thing, which is a color value. But HSB allows us to think about color in a more sort of normal context to how we talk about color. And so we can change P5 to use HSB. And when we do that, we can tell it what units we want to use. So we can say if we want it to be from 0 to 255 or 0 to 100 or whatever. And so I think the default is 100. Let's see if we can find out. Let's go down here and read. Okay, so it doesn't actually tell us the defaults. So we can play around with it and figure it out. But we can set the defaults if we want to. Okay, so anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a sketch with a few different colors, but I'm also going to set up the shapes that I use so that we can see the contrast between the colors. And then we'll be able to see how math kind of changes the way that we see the colors. So this is my color modes example. And so in setup, I'm going to change the color mode to HSB. And I'm not going to set the values for now. I'm just going to play around with the values and figure something out. So, so now when I set a color, I'm going to make a rectangle. I'm going to make my canvas a little bit larger for this example. So I'm going to do the canvas as 600 by 400. And so I'm going to do a rect on half the canvas, a rectangle. So I'll start at 0, 0, and half the canvas is 300 pixels wide. And the height, I want to do the whole canvas. So I'm making a rectangle, and we're going to do a fill and no stroke. So I'm going to say no stroke, and then we're going to set the fill. Okay, so now if I set the fill, if I say 0, and let's guess it's 100, you're going to see that hue value is red. So now this first number, since we're in HSB, the first number represents hue. So if I do like 100, it's going to be green. If I do 200, it goes back to blue. If I go to, let's see if I go to 360, it should be red. Okay, so that means we're going from 0 to 360 is our is sort of the whole circle around the color wheel. I think the default for saturation and brightness is 100. So if I take the saturation and I set it to 0, it should be white. And if I take the brightness and set it to 0, it should be black. And if I set these values somewhere in the middle, we're going to get a slightly desaturated, slightly darker version of that color. So I'm going to copy this and paste it. So I'm going to have color 1. And then I'm going to have color 2. And I'm going to move this over. So I'm just going to move my rectangle over to the other side. So now I've got the same color. And so I can make changes to this color just by changing one number. So I'm going to set this back to 0. That's that red that we started with. And so now instead of 0, if I just change this number, it'll change the hue. So let's say I set it to 120. Okay, so now I've got red and green. And if I set it to 240, I'll have red and blue. And if I want it to be on the exact opposite side, so remember when we're dealing with hue, we have the color wheel, which is 360. So we can go around the color wheel to get different colors. And the Adobe Color Picker is a good way to visualize this. So if I set this to complementary, it's going to show me the color that's exactly on the opposite side of the wheel from wherever I am. So if I'm in the red range, it'll be somewhere over here. If I set it to triad, this is going to be 120 degrees from the original color. And then if there's other values like monochromatic, they're all going to be in the same hue. If I set square, we're going to get 90 degrees separation. If I do compound, we're going to get different, versions. We can kind of get, different stuff. If I set analogous, it's going to be sort of on either side of our main color value. And so that's a good way to kind of see the relationships of colors to each other. So I can, depending on what kind of color change I'm going to go to, I can set the hue up here, and then I can set, the exact opposite or complementary color down here just by going 180 degrees around the circle. So now I can go to my color 3. And for this one, I'm going to put my rectangle in a slightly different place. So I'm going to use a different fill here. Let's go halfway in between. So we'll do 90, 50, 50. And I'm going to do a rectangle. And I'm going to try to put it kind of in the middle here. So I'm going to say if this guy starts at 0 and is 300 wide, I'm going to start this at 100. And if it's 400 tall, I'll put it at, I'll start with 150. And then I'm going to do 100 for the width, and I'll do 100 for the height. Okay. So now we've got another rectangle. And so notice how different the color looks immediately just by adding in that rectangle. Okay, so that's the first one, but then I'm also going to put this color. So I'm going to copy this rectangle, and I'm going to move it to the other side. So I'm going to set this to like 400. And so now I've got two colors on both sides. It looks very different for me on my computer screen than it kind of does in the projector. But hopefully you'll be able to see when I change this color. So let's say I do like 30 instead. The way that you perceive the color embedded inside the other two colors, as well as the way that you perceive the main colors, should sort of change depending on which color you're looking at. If I just do like a small difference, you can kind of see the effect we're getting. If I go somewhere closer to the green color, we get a different effect there. If I go kind of more close to the middle, it's also going to change if I play with the saturation. So another thing I could do, this would be like changing the hue example. But let's save this. I'm going to say hue example here, and I'll save this. And then I'm just going to make a copy of this. So I'm going to go to File or actually, let me change the title too, so we know what this is. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate this. And this time, instead of varying the hue, I'm going to vary the saturation. And you don't have to do one at a time. You can do multiple ones. But for this one, I'm going to use the same hue. So maybe I'll use like 240 as my base hue. So if I put those in for each color, obviously they're all the same, but I can vary the saturation. So maybe I'll start with 80 and then go to 70 and then go to 60. So we can start to kind of like see how these very small changes in certain values of the color change the way we perceive the colors and the way the colors mix together. And the goal for Albers was to try to find things that really show you things about different colors and about the relationship between colors that become very obvious from the way that they interact with each other. So if I make larger gaps in the saturation, maybe if I start with 100 and go to 60 and 20, we'll see how that changes things. And so the idea for this assignment is to make a simple composition with a few shapes. It doesn't have to look exactly like this. I encourage you to try different ideas with the shapes as well. But what I want you to do is find, a simple composition with shapes, but then use different color variations, just like Albers does. So like we saw previously with his paintings, where he has the same combination of shapes with different colors. I want to see, a few variations where it's the same shapes but different colors, where the colors are doing something that's kind of interesting. So I'll review submitting the project and go over what it should look like a little bit. But then we'll have workshop time for you guys to work on it. So if I want to save an image from my sketch, remember that I can just add in the function mouse pressed, and I'll just use the save function and give it a name. So I'll call this color.png. And now if I click on here, it's going to save that image to my downloads folder. So I'm going to make a couple of variations to the color. So maybe I'll see if this looks different in a different hue. Maybe I'll change all the hues to 120, see how that looks. Okay, so that's interesting. Let's see if they look interesting next to each other. It's kind of cool. Let's try changing the brightness and see if that has a big effect. It's a little too dark. Maybe I'll do more like 25. And maybe I'll try a different hue, maybe 90. Kind of just trying random colors, but trying to come up with something interesting. Maybe I'll try 240. Anyway, I'll just play around with this until I get something that kind of, seems interesting or stands out. Not all of the combinations are going to be that interesting. But I'll find some different combinations that kind of show different interesting relationships. And so once I have a few variations, I'll post the work. So your code may not look exactly like the images. It's fine to kind of play around with the code and export different images. But you can also make copies and save it if you want to save each version. But when you've got a few images that you're ready to post, I'll just review the posting process. So on the Open Lab, if you're logged in and you've joined the class, you'll see a plus button. You can click on the plus button. It's going to ask you to choose a category. So you can go to categories, and there should be a category for each assignment. So this is assignment 2, color. And you can name the assignment, my color study. And then we can just add our images. Just going to collapse this. Okay. So you can just drag the images on here. One thing that you'll notice, if you drag all 3 images on here, it's going to make what's called a gallery. That's fine if you want to use a gallery, but it's going to try to put them together. But you can just, change the columns like that. You can also just add the images one at a time. And so then for your description, remember it's just a short 1 or 2 sentence description. So you can just talk about what you created and what you were interested in or what you explored. So you could say, I was interested in exploring different saturation levels to see their effect on my composition. And then, of course, just a link to the code for the project. So just copy that link and paste it in there. And we don't want to embed, so just convert to link. And so that's the basic idea for this assignment. Just playing around with color, not focusing on necessarily shape or making something representational. Just thinking about color and how you can, play with different color values. You don't have to use HSB if you don't want to. You could use RGB and see if there's interesting relationships with RGB that you can explore. You could use, named colors. However you want to use the color is fine. But the end result should be something that is like exploring color on its own. We're just thinking about how color works for this week. All right, so that's it for now. We'll have some workshop time. You guys can work on this assignment. If you have any questions or want feedback on anything, let me know. I'm happy to take a look. Stop here.